In uncertain times, the mind reaches outward, searching for a steady figure to trust, a face, a voice, a name that seems capable of holding the weight of confusion. History, memory, and instinct often teach us to look for heroes, strong leaders, upright officers, decisive administrators appear reassuring when the ground feels unsteady. Stories of governance are frequently told this way. A reformer arrives, corruption recedes. A brave officer stands firm, and order is restored. The arc feels simple, almost comforting. Media narratives reinforce this habit gently but persistently. Headlines carry names more easily than procedures. Personalities travel faster than processes across public conversation. Even in exam preparation, governance is often remembered through individuals. Model administrators, visionary leaders, and iconic judges quietly occupy more space than institutional design. This tendency is not a flaw. It is deeply human. Faces are easier to relate to than frameworks, and stories feel warmer when they have a protagonist. Yet governance, especially in a democracy, unfolds over long stretches of time. Longer than careers, longer than tenures, longer than moments of public admiration. A question then arises, softly, without accusation. What happens when the admired officer is transferred, promoted, or retires into quiet anonymity? What happens when a celebrated leader loses an election, steps aside, or makes an error that no one expected from them? What happens when even the most capable individual is constrained by fatigue, limitation, or circumstance? These moments are rarely dramatic. There is no sudden collapse, no loud announcement. Work continues the next morning, files move, services function, decisions are made. Something less visible carries the weight forward. It does not trend, it does not speak often, and it rarely receives applause. This quieter presence is easy to miss because it does not arrive with promise. It was already there before the individual arrived, and it remains after they leave. James Madison once reflected that reliance on men alone was never enough because men themselves are imperfect. Systems were imagined precisely to hold this truth gently. Closer home, Ambedkar warned that hero worship in public life could become a path away from constitutional morality, not toward it. Such reflections were not dismissals of leadership. They were acknowledgments of human fragility, spoken with realism rather than cynicism. Courts, too, have echoed this sentiment in calmer language. More than once, judges have reminded us that the rule of law stands above the rule of individuals. When judgments speak of continuity, procedure, and restraint, they quietly signal that justice cannot depend on personal virtue alone. Rules, once framed, begin to outlive their framers. They travel across decades, interpreted by different hands, applied to changing realities. Institutions absorb human variation. They soften the impact of brilliance and limit the damage of failure without drawing attention to themselves. In public imagination, this work feels unremarkable. There are no dramatic speeches, only steady repetition and patient adherence. Yet this is how governance survives ordinary days, not through exceptional moments, but through predictable ones. For students of public administration and constitutional governance, this realization arrives slowly, often after disappointment, sometimes after quiet observation. It becomes clear that democracy cannot pause between heroes. It must function on days when no one extraordinary is present. The design, therefore, had to be resilient. It had to assume average humans, imperfect choices, and uneven intentions. Democracy was never meant to be a relay race of great individuals handing over hope. It was meant to be a structure that carries ordinary people safely. This thought does not diminish leadership. It places leadership within something larger, steadier, and more enduring. As we reflect on institutions, we begin to sense that their greatest strength lies in not needing exceptional people at all. Perhaps this is the quiet confidence built into democratic design. A reassurance that governance continues even when heroes step away. The Constitution does not begin with a celebration of great leaders. It begins with an acceptance of human limits, quietly acknowledging that power, when left unstructured, tends to drift. Its framers had lived through moments when intentions were strong, but outcomes were uncertain. They understood that virtue alone could not be the foundation of governance. Instead of asking who should rule, the Constitution asked a different question. How should power be arranged so that no one carries it alone? This shift is subtle but profound. Faith is placed not in personalities, but in arrangements, processes, and carefully balanced responsibilities. Institutions emerge from this thinking as stabilizers. They slow down impulse, introduce consultation, and create space for reflection before action. The idea of rule of law grows from the same soil. Not the rule of the best person, but the rule of agreed principles applied consistently. In such a design, even those with authority submit to something larger than themselves. Decisions are expected to travel through procedure, not preference. Power is deliberately divided, not because cooperation is doubted, but because concentration is feared. The legislature debates and represents. The executive acts and implements. The judiciary interprets and restrains. None is imagined as complete on its own. This separation is not mechanical. It is conversational. Each institution speaks to the others, sometimes in agreement, sometimes in disagreement. Checks and balances arise naturally from this conversation. One authority pauses another, not to obstruct, but to ask whether power is being exercised within limits. When a decision is reviewed, questioned, or delayed, it is often seen as inefficiency. Yet this pause is intentional, almost protective. The Constitution seems to whisper that speed is not always wisdom, and decisiveness is not always justice. Human fallibility is assumed everywhere in this design. Errors are expected, biases anticipated, and ambitions quietly acknowledged. Institutions absorb these imperfections. They do not eliminate them, but they reduce their capacity to harm. Ambedkar once observed that constitutional morality was not a natural sentiment. It had to be cultivated, learned, and sustained through institutions. This thought carries a certain humility. It admits that good intentions alone cannot guarantee fair outcomes. Consider a simple administrative decision. An officer may sincerely believe a particular action serves public interest. Yet, procedure requires reasons to be recorded, files to move, and approvals to be sought. This is not distrust. It is discipline. If that decision is challenged, another institution reviews it, not to question intent, but to examine conformity with law. In this process, democracy protects itself from both malice and misplaced confidence. Judicial pronouncements have often reflected this restraint. Courts remind themselves that power must be exercised, not enjoyed. They speak of boundaries, of self-imposed limits, of knowing when to step back. This restraint is not weakness. It is an institutional ethic developed over time. Parliament too functions within rules that slow down enthusiasm. Bills are debated, sent to committees, returned for reconsideration. These steps may feel repetitive, even frustrating. Yet they ensure that lawmaking is not reduced to momentary majorities. The executive operates within this framework, translating policy into action, accountable upward and outward. Civil services become carriers of continuity here. Transfers happen, governments change, but institutional memory persists. Files, precedents, manuals, and norms quietly ensure that governance does not restart with every new personality. The Constitution seems deeply aware that individuals come with emotions, pressures, and limitations. Institutions, by contrast, come with records, procedures, and collective responsibility. This does not make institutions morally superior. It makes them structurally safer. Over time, this design builds predictability. Citizens may not know who will hold office tomorrow, but they know how decisions are meant to be made. Predictability is a form of trust. It allows disagreement without fear, and change without collapse. Even dissent is institutionalized. Courts, legislatures, media, and civil society all find space within constitutional structure. This space ensures that frustration does not need to turn into rebellion to be heard. To be heard. When institutions function, democracy breathes slowly. When they weaken, the search for saviors becomes urgent again. The Constitution anticipates this temptation. It quietly redirects attention back to systems. It does not deny leadership. It places leadership within boundaries. Strong intentions are welcomed, but they must pass through agreed paths. This is how democracy survives ordinary days, not heroic ones. Institutions allow governance to continue when individuals disagree, err, or leave. They are the unseen architecture holding up visible politics. As listeners and as students of governance, noticing this architecture changes perspective. It becomes easier to understand why patience, procedure, and restraint are repeatedly emphasized. The Constitution, in its calm confidence, seems to trust that structures endure longer than individuals. And in that trust lies the quiet strength of constitutional democracy. Parliament often enters public imagination through sound and image. Raised voices, sharp exchanges, familiar faces returning night after night on television screens. In this portrayal, Parliament appears theatrical, almost personal. Leaders dominate the frame, and the institution seems to shrink behind them. Yet, Parliament was never designed as a stage. It was imagined as a working space, slow, procedural, and deliberately collective. Its true rhythm is not found in the moment of speech, but in the long arc of discussion, disagreement, and revision. At its core, Parliament exists to give law a public journey. Ideas do not become binding commands in isolation. They are introduced, questioned, altered, paused, and sometimes withdrawn. This movement is the essence of democratic lawmaking. When a proposal enters Parliament, it carries intention, not finality. Its strength is tested through multiple voices. Members speak not only for themselves, but for constituencies, experiences, and concerns that rarely share a single viewpoint. This multiplicity is not a weakness. It is the condition under which legitimacy is built. Deliberation slows down certainty. It allows doubt to surface, and in doing so, improves clarity. A law shaped in conversation tends to survive longer than one shaped in confidence. Parliament also carries another quiet responsibility. It keeps the executive visible. Through routine questioning, explanations are demanded without drama. Authority is asked to speak in reasons, not declarations. This daily accountability is rarely remembered, yet it forms the backbone of responsible governance. A minister answering questions is not performing. The institution is reminding power that it is being observed. These exchanges may appear repetitive, but repetition is how memory is built into institutions. Rules that allow questions, clarifications, and follow-ups create a culture where explanation becomes normal. Over time, this normalization restrains arbitrary action more effectively than confrontation. Opposition plays a critical role in this design, not as obstruction, but as institutional balance. Dissent introduces friction, and friction generates scrutiny. Without disagreement, consensus becomes automatic. Without challenge, error becomes invisible. The presence of opposition ensures that legislation encounters resistance before it encounters reality. This resistance is not personal. It is structural. Even a well-intentioned government benefits from being questioned. Institutions assume this without offense. Committees operate in this quieter space. Away from cameras, away from slogans, they return to detail. Here, expertise matters more than applause. Language is refined, impacts assessed, and unintended consequences considered. Members listen more than they speak. Law begins to resemble craftsmanship rather than announcement. Many significant improvements in legislation emerge from this patient process. Clauses are redrafted, definitions clarified, and safeguards added. These changes rarely carry individual signatures. They belong to the institution. Consider a welfare law proposed with urgency and moral clarity. Initial intent may be strong, but details remain fragile. Through parliamentary examination, concerns about implementation, funding, and inclusion are raised. The law returns changed, not weakened, but steadied. What emerges is not the vision of one mind, but the agreement of many. This is how Parliament protects democracy from both haste and hesitation. It absorbs political energy and converts it into structured outcome. Judicial observations have often noted this deliberative role. Courts recognize that legislative wisdom lies not in infallibility, but in process. When laws reflect debate, courts are more inclined to respect legislative judgment. Parliament, therefore, strengthens not only democracy, but constitutional balance. Its procedures act as memory. Past debates inform future choices. New members inherit not just seats, but traditions of discussion. Over time, Parliament becomes an archive of collective reasoning. Televised moments capture only fragments of this work. The real labor happens in documents, revisions, and explanations. This labor is slow by design. Democracy chose slowness over simplicity. Parliament embodies this choice every day. It ensures that no single individual defines the law unilaterally. Leadership matters, but leadership here is distributed. Authority is exercised through persuasion, not command. Even majorities are required to listen. This listening is institutional, not emotional. It protects minorities without paralyzing governance. It allows change without erasure. The institution remains, even as individuals rotate through it. Faces change, but procedures endure. This endurance is Parliament's quiet strength. When frustration arises about inefficiency, it helps to remember this design. Parliament was not built for speed. It was built for legitimacy. For those preparing to serve within this system, this understanding is grounding. It shifts attention from spectacle to structure, from personalities to processes. Parliament, in its essence, is not a gathering of voices. It is a method of thinking together. And in that method lies its enduring relevance. The bureaucracy rarely occupies imagination the way leaders do. It works without spectacle, carrying forward decisions made elsewhere, often without recognition. Yet this quiet continuity is precisely its purpose. When governments change and priorities shift, something must remain steady. The civil services were designed as that steady presence, not permanent in power, but permanent in service. This permanence is not privilege. It is responsibility stretched across time. Files remember what speeches forget. Notes preserve reasoning long after debates fade. In this sense, bureaucracy becomes the memory of the state. The Constitution entrusts executive authority to elected governments, but execution travels through institutions. This arrangement accepts a simple truth. Policies come and go. Administration must endure. Articles that confer executive power do so with an assumption of continuity. Authority flows, but channels remain. Civil servants operate within these channels, translating political will into lawful action. Their neutrality is often misunderstood. It does not mean absence of values. It means fidelity to rules over preferences and to office over opinion. Political neutrality protects democracy in subtle ways. It ensures that disagreement in elections does not disrupt governance the next morning. A district office opens regardless of who won yesterday. Schools function, pensions are paid, and records are maintained. This ordinariness is not accidental. It is institutional design. Rules bind officers not to weaken them, but to protect them. Safeguards around service conditions exist because authority can be misused from any side. Article 311, often mentioned quietly, reflects this caution. It recognizes that security of tenure allows honest advice. An officer who fears arbitrary removal cannot speak truth to power. Protection, therefore, serves citizens as much as officers. It allows decisions to be questioned internally before they become public mistakes. Sardar Patel once described civil servants as the steel frame of administration. The phrase is often repeated, but its meaning is simple. A frame does not decide the design. It holds it up. Bureaucracy does not replace leadership. It supports it. Consider a change of government at the state level. Policies are revised, slogans shift, and priorities are reordered. Yet land records remain accessible. Hospitals continue admissions. Schemes are restructured, not erased overnight. This continuity prevents governance from becoming episodic. Citizens are not asked to pause their lives between elections. Administrative memory ensures learning over time. Past failures inform present caution. Previous court observations shape future drafting. Institutional memory prevents repetition of error. This memory is collective, not personal. Officers transfer. Posts rotate. What remains are manuals, precedents, and practices. This collective memory also restrains excess. When pressure builds for haste, procedure insists on pause. When enthusiasm overrides feasibility, files demand justification. These moments are often invisible to the public eye, yet they quietly protect public interest. Judicial scrutiny frequently relies on this record. Courts ask not only what was decided, but how. Bureaucratic processes provide that answer. They allow accountability without personalization. Mistakes are examined institutionally, not emotionally. This does not mean bureaucracy is flawless. Like all human systems, it reflects limitations. But institutions are designed to correct over time. Training, review, and precedent act as internal correctives. The expectation is not perfection, but reliability. Citizens approach the state through offices, not ideologies. They encounter counters, forms, and procedures. Predictability here becomes a form of dignity. Knowing what to expect reduces dependence on favor. Rules replace requests. Entitlement replaces appeal. This shift is deeply democratic. For officers, too, institutions offer shelter. They provide a framework within which difficult decisions can be made. Personal blame is reduced when action follows rule. Courage becomes sustainable when supported by structure. This balance is delicate. Too much rigidity harms responsiveness. Too much discretion risks arbitrariness. Institutions exist to hold this balance. Over decades, civil services have adapted quietly. Technology changes. Procedures evolve. Yet, the core idea remains stable. Governance must not restart with every election. The bureaucracy ensures this does not happen. In public discourse, impatience often targets process. Delays are criticized, files mocked. Yet speed without memory is dangerous. Institutions slow action so that consequences can be seen. This slowness is not resistance. It is caution institutionalized. For aspirants preparing to enter this system, this perspective matters. The role is not to shine, but to sustain. Not to dominate outcomes, but to preserve fairness. Bureaucracy, at its best, is not powerful. It is dependable. It stands between changing politics and constant citizens. In doing so, it protects both. The memory of the state lives here, quietly, steadily, without applause. Institutions rarely collapse loudly. They thin out quietly, like a habit no longer practiced with care. Governance does not suddenly fail. It begins to lean gently toward convenience. When pressure mounts, Procedure starts to feel like delay rather than protection. Rules are seen as obstacles, not safeguards. Speed becomes a virtue in itself. Decisions are praised for quickness, not for soundness. At first, this feels efficient. Files move faster. Clearances arrive sooner. Results appear immediate. But something subtle shifts beneath this momentum. Processes designed to slow power are shortened. Consultation becomes selective. Institutional memory is treated as optional. Over time, discretion expands quietly. What was once an exception begins to feel normal. Personal judgment replaces collective reasoning. Intentions may remain sincere. Outcomes, however, grow fragile. When individuals carry decisions alone, error has no cushion. There is no committee to soften impact. No record to explain reasoning later. Accountability begins to blur. If success occurs, credit is personal. If failure follows, responsibility scatters. Institutions were designed to prevent this imbalance. They distribute both authority and blame. When they weaken, both concentrate. Loyalty then starts to matter more than role. Agreement becomes safer than disagreement. Silence feels prudent. Dissent feels risky. These shifts are rarely announced. They are sensed in corridors, not declared in offices. Rules are still present, but unevenly applied. Precedent is remembered selectively. Exceptions multiply. Citizens begin to notice inconsistency. Similar cases receive different outcomes. Predictability fades. Trust follows. Public confidence depends less on outcomes than on fairness. Even an unfavorable decision feels bearable when process is visible. When process disappears, suspicion grows. Institutions once acted as buffers. They absorbed anger and moderated disappointment. Without them, frustration travels directly to faces. Governance becomes personal. Praise and blame attach to individuals. This intensifies pressure on leadership. Expectations rise beyond human capacity. Failure then feels like betrayal. A system built on heroes demands constant excellence. No one can sustain that demand. Lord Acton once reflected that power tends to corrupt. His warning was not about individuals alone. It was about unchecked power. Institutions exist to check power without hostility. They restrain without accusing. They slow without obstructing. When restraint is seen as weakness, decay begins. Short-term efficiency often hides long-term cost. Quick decisions may bypass consultation. Immediate relief may ignore future consequence. Over time, repair becomes harder. Institutions, once bypassed, forget how to function fully. Skills erode. Norms weaken. Successors inherit thinner structures. Rebuilding trust takes longer than breaking it. Courts have occasionally observed this gently. They speak of due process not as formality, but as essence. Fairness not as outcome, but as method. These reminders are rarely dramatic. They are careful, restrained. They reflect institutional self-awareness. A democracy does not collapse when institutions weaken. It becomes unpredictable. Uncertainty replaces stability. Citizens adjust behavior. They seek shortcuts. They look for access, not entitlement. This is how inequality quietly deepens. Institutions once equalized interaction. Rules applied uniformly. When weakened, proximity matters more. Distance costs more. None of this requires ill intent. It grows from fatigue, impatience, and urgency. Institutions demand patience. They ask leaders to wait, to listen, to explain. In times of pressure, these demands feel heavy. Yet, they are precisely what protect democracy then. This section is not a warning. It is an observation. Patterns repeat across systems and societies. Where institutions thin, individuals thicken. Where individuals dominate, systems shrink. The balance is delicate. Democracy survives not by constant vigilance alone, but by everyday adherence to process. Institutions ask for this adherence quietly. They do not promise speed. They promise stability. And stability, over time, becomes freedom. Institutions are often spoken of as structures, but they are lived as responsibilities. They do not ask to be admired. They ask to be carried forward intact. Every individual who enters public life does so temporarily. Tenure is finite, authority borrowed. What remains is the office, unchanged in name, altered only by use. This understanding quietly shapes constitutional design. People are expected to serve roles, not merge with them. Power passes through hands, but does not belong to them. Officers arrive with training and conviction. They leave with files handed over, notes recorded, work unfinished. The institution continues without pause. Legislatures change composition. New voices replace old ones. Yet the House remains, holding memory beyond faces. Debates echo differently, but procedure stays steady. Institutions carry values that outlast enthusiasm. Equality, fairness, restraint travel forward through routine. They do not depend on remembrance. They depend on repetition. Public service, in this light, resembles trusteeship, something held carefully, knowing it must be passed on. Legacy becomes less personal. It becomes invisible. One is remembered not by imprint, but by absence of damage. This restraint is rarely celebrated. It feels unspectacular. Yet it is deeply constitutional. The idea that institutions must never serve individuals sits quietly at the center. When this balance holds, authority feels lighter. Decisions are shared. Responsibility diffused. When it shifts, roles blur. Offices begin to reflect personalities. Institutions narrow the tide. The Constitution anticipates this risk. It places offices above occupants, rules above discretion, process above impulse, not to diminish agency, but to locate it. Individuals bring energy. Institutions give direction. Energy without direction dissipates. Direction without energy stagnates. The balance is delicate. Civil servants feel this in everyday work, signing files that will outlive their posting, implementing policies conceived elsewhere, leaving behind systems rather than signatures. Judges experience it in restraint, knowing when not to intervene, when to let institutions speak to each other. Legislators feel it in debate, accepting that persuasion matters more than volume, that outcomes improve through listening. In each case, service replaces ownership. The institution is not a platform. It is a passage. Citizens encounter the state through this passage. Their experience depends on continuity, not charisma. Predictability becomes trust. Trust becomes legitimacy. This legitimacy is fragile. It requires constant care, not dramatic defense, quiet adherence. Institutions do not ask individuals to disappear. They ask them to fit, to accept limits, to recognize predecessors and successors. This acceptance softens ambition. It grounds authority. The idea of trusteeship carries humility. One does not redesign the house. One maintains it, repairs where needed, leaves it standing. Across generations, governance resembles a relay. Hands change. The baton remains. Each runner covers a stretch. No one runs the entire course. Fatigue is expected. Renewal is built in. Institutions make this possible. They hold the race together. At the end of service, nothing dramatic occurs. A charge is handed over. A desk cleared. Work resumes. The institution does not pause to remember. It continues to function. This continuity is not indifference. It is design. A reassurance that democracy does not depend on any one presence, only on shared commitment to form. In this understanding, service feels quieter, less urgent, more durable. Institutions endure because individuals let them, by not occupying too much space, by leaving room for those who follow. The Constitution seems to rest here, in this gentle expectation. That power will pass. That process will stay. That governance will continue. Even when voices fall silent, even when names fade, the work goes on, unfinished, unconcluded, still moving forward.